Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to look at the Neoclassical Perspective of Economics, Chapter 13 in your OpenStax macro textbook. And basically this is the follow-up to Chapter 12, which looked at the Keynesian perspective. And remember, the Keynesian perspective basically said, hey, we can solve our recession issues with fiscal policy. It's just a matter of demand. Supply rises to meet demand. And so what we need to do is drive aggregate demand up. And that's how we'll solve the problem. The Keynesian perspective looked at a downward sloping Phillips curve representing the trade-offs between unemployment and inflation. And one of the big ideas from the Keynesian perspective was that prices and wages are sticky. Today, we're going to look at the neoclassical perspective. And it's a little bit of a different way of looking at the same issues. It's a little bit of a different way of modeling long-run aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand, and that whole model. And we're going to have some different assumptions. We're going to think that we're going to focus more on the long term. We're going to see prices and wages as being more flexible, and we're going to assume that we have a vertical long-run aggregate supply curve. And that's just going to have some different implications for how we expect recessions to behave and how we handle them and what we should do. So we're going to have some new technology, but really not that, some new terminology, but really not that much. We've covered a lot of the terms that are going to come up in chapters 11 and 12, because we're going to be talking about the same stuff. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply, real GDP, price level inflation, GDP growth rates, unemployment, cyclical unemployment, structural unemployment, those kinds of things. What's new in this chapter is we are going to be talking about expectations. So we're going to talk about adaptive expectations and expected inflation. We're also going to talk about rational expectations and about physical capital per person or capital per capita, just as a way of trying to understand what our true potential or full employment GDP is down here. And so that's going to be an important idea too. All right, you guys ready to get started? Grab your book, grab your slides, grab your notes, and let's get into it. So, this week we are looking at the neoclassical perspective on macroeconomics, recessions, and how to solve them, looking at inflation, unemployment, and GDP. So we're going to go through and look at the building blocks of the neoclassical analysis, policy implications for the neoclassical perspective, and then we're going to balance the two back together. We're going to bring it all together and compare and contrast Keynesian and neoclassical perspectives of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and basically talk about how they're both a little right and they're both a little wrong. And the reality is we don't have perfect information about this. And so that's what we'll try to do, is evaluate how both of them would react to a recession and analyze the sort of interdependence between them. So again, the book is going to, and every macroeconomist is going to want to tie this back to the Great Recession. And that's just because for a lot of us, that's the closest we get to understanding a true deep recession. Even when we look at the macroeconomic effects of the pandemic, we don't see the same kind of typical recession behavior. We did see massive unemployment, but GDP actually didn't take too much of a hit. And so the Great Recession really behaves like a traditional recession, and that's why we're always going to want to anchor to it. And just like I said last time, one of the big signs was the housing market collapsed. We saw a lot of buildings abandoned mid-construction. We saw a huge rise in homelessness, huge rise in unemployment. And so we're always going to kind of link back to that as a reminder for why we care and why we would want to study this kind of stuff. And that's because we want to know what to do, because there was a period of time where macroeconomists thought, hey, we've got this figured out. We know how to manage the economy and keep from having Great Depression style failures. And then the Great Recession happened. And so we kind of now know that we don't know everything, and we need to keep studying these things to get better and get a better understanding of how to handle them. So the neoclassical perspective is the philosophy that in the long run, the business cycle is going to fluctuate around the potential or full employment level of economics. It's going to move a little bit this way, a little bit that way, but we're basically going to be moving around an equilibrium. And the two big things we're going to talk about in the neoclassical perspective is potential GDP being the determinant of an economy's size, and that wages and prices are going to adjust flexibly. This is a big difference from the Keynesian perspective. Remember, Keynes said, hey, prices and wages are really sticky, and so we're not going to see a lot of changes in the price level when we enter depressions and recessions. The neoclassical view is totally different. It says, yes, you're going to see flexible prices, and that's going to help us move back to our potential or full employment level of GDP and our level of output. So the idea here is that overall, in the long run, potential GDP determines the size of real GDP. What does that mean? It means that our economy is, in the neoclassical perspective, not driven by demand, but driven by our resources, what we can produce. And that's going to be based on all of the inputs we have. And so the way I like to think of that as I graph this out is the components that make up the GDP production function. So those are Y equals A times L N K H. Technology, labor, natural resources, physical capital, and human capital. That's kind of what we're talking about in the book too, right? The book says land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial ability. The idea here is that we have some level of potential productivity based on everything in our economy. So let's say we took a snapshot of our economy today. We have some number of businesses, we have some number of factories, some number of cars, some quantity of ideas, some number of workers, and hours in a day. What we can produce is based on that. Producing more or less than that is going to be basically being in a recession, having low price level, low unemployment, or being in a period where we are in inflationary pressure and we're producing too much. And so what we're going to expect is this vertical, long run aggregate supply curve to represent that. And that's just presenting this idea that, yeah, we have a potential GDP or full employment GDP or natural rate of unemployment level of GDP around which our economy will fluctuate. While the unemployment rate might never be zero, we can get cyclical business cycle unemployment to zero. And so we're always going to have some natural rate of unemployment based on people looking for a new job, based on seasonal unemployment. And this gets back to when we talked about employment and different types of unemployment, right? There's always some unemployment. That's actually a sign of a well-functioning economy. What we can do is get to zero cyclical unemployment, right? No unemployment that is the result of a recession. And so economists will benchmark or refer back to real GDP against potential GDP to try and determine how well the economy is doing. Are we above or below where we think our potential is? And that's basically what we're talking about with the neoclassical perspective. When we think about this idea of this long-run aggregate supply curve, one of the things that we can do is, if we want to grow our economy, we have to grow this stuff. And so what we tend to do is basically divide everything by the number of people in our society. And we do that so that we can get GDP per capita, and then we have our natural resources per capita, our physical capital per capita, and our human capital per capita. And what we're doing when we do that is we're trying to look at how much productivity do we really have. And the idea here is that we're going to grow our economy. There's not much we can do about our natural resources, but what we can do if we want to grow our economy is invest in physical and human capital, right? We want to invest in physical capital per capita or per person. And that's just the amount of productivity machinery we have. Equipment, computers, whatever the parts are, the equipment associated with producing goods and services. We want to know how much physical capital we have per capita. And we can also talk about our human capital per capita, right? How much education, knowledge, and training are we developing per person? But the idea is these are going to be the drivers of this. We can increase our physical capital or human capital per capita, and that would shift long-run aggregate supply out. That's the only way to get us to a higher level of GDP. So when we look at potential and actual GDP, and this is in real terms measured in 2012 dollars, we can see this blue line, this straight line is basically our potential real GDP. And it's rising over time because between the 60s and the 2020s, we've had a massive increase in our physical and our human capital. We have new technological advancements, we have more equipment, we have more machinery, and we've gotten smarter as a society, right? Our educational attainment has gone up. So our potential GDP has increased too. Our real GDP, on the other hand, has kind of oscillated a little bit above and below it. So we can see a recession here in the 80s, a little recession in the 90s, a little bit of excessive growth in the late 90s, early 2000s. And then we have the Great Recession here in 2008. But then we recover back up to potential GDP here in 12, 15. And then, of course, in 2020, we take another dip. But that's kind of another way of looking at the business cycle, right? It's not up and down, this massive variation necessarily in GDP growth rate. It can just be real GDP fluctuating around our potential GDP as a function of the inputs into our economy. So, potential GDP is estimated by the Congressional Budget Office. They're the same people who estimate the fiscal impacts of some legislative policies and look at lots of data in our economy. They're considered nonpartisan. They are just, people tracking the data of the U.S. economy. Most economic recessions and economic expansion periods, upswings, occur when the economy is just 1 to 3% above or below GDP. So really small changes around that potential GDP in a given period of time. So in the neoclassical model, we want to draw a long-run aggregate supply curve. That's a vertical line that indicates that level of potential or full employment GDP. That means that the price level is going to have no effect. It doesn't matter how high or low the price level gets. That's not going to change how much we can produce. How much we can produce is based on the inputs we have. Over time, we'll see long-run aggregate supply shift out. If you think about long-run aggregate supply in the 80s, think about the computers, cars, the education we had in the 80s relative to 2020, 2025, right? We've seen those things increase a lot over that period of time. And so that would represent an increase in long-run aggregate supply over several years. It's going to tend to shift to the right, and real potential GDP is going to tend to increase as we increase our productivity along these dimensions. The basis of neoclassical economics is that the macroeconomy is going to tend to adjust. And this comes from the idea that, okay, yeah, maybe Keynes is right and prices and wages are sticky in the short run, but in the long run, they're going to adjust. So when you think about what we talked about in the Keynesian chapter, we said things like, firms don't want to, make their customers unhappy by changing prices regularly. Yeah, but there's also going to be a point where you have to change prices and wages will go up or go down if the economy is growing or shrinking. And so even though we might see prices and wages be sticky in the short run, in the long run, they're going to adjust. People get raises. It happens, right? So an economy is going to produce above its potential level of GDP or below its potential level of GDP in the short run, but that's going to be unsustainable. And so in the long run, they're going to return to that potential level of output. Over the long run, a surge in aggregate demand might increase the price level, but it's not going to have a huge effect on GDP because our real GDP is just based on what we have the capacity to produce. So we can look at it this way. So I'll go ahead and throw in our aggregate demand curve here and our short run aggregate supply curve. And aggregate supply is going to be upward sloping in the short run because in the short run, we are going to see the possibility of a expansion in the economy driving prices up or a recession driving prices and wages down, but it's not going to long run affect us. So let's look at how that would work. A little bit weird there, sorry, that's a G. Aggregate supply. Okay, so if we start out with an initial equilibrium here at our real GDP, our potential full employment level of GDP, what will happen if we see something shift? If aggregate demand increases and we see a shift from the initial level to a new higher level of aggregate demand. Well, the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to see a new higher level of output, right? And a new higher price level. Okay? And that's going to be above where we were initially. So then the idea is when we're up here, we're going to see unemployment go down too low. This is kind of a funny story. I had a family member hire an electrician, and the person came in and kind of made a mess and did a bad job. And in the end, my family member had to hire a new electrician to fix what the old electrician did. And she's an accountant, and she made the joke, well, that's a low unemployment person. And the idea is sometimes unemployment is so low that people get hired to jobs that they're not really well suited to. And so that's what might be happening here. We're at really high GDP. And so maybe people are sort of working beyond capacity. We're running machinery too far. But what's definitely happening is employers are really competing for workers. And while employers compete for workers, we're going to actually move up this short run aggregate supply curve to this new equilibrium because we're going to see wages be higher, and that's going to drive prices up. It's going to make it more expensive because we are churning so high that you have to pay people more to get them to work more, right? And so we're going to see prices tend to go up and everything's going to kind of get more expensive. Here's the problem. A rise in prices in the short run, that increases the cost of producing goods and services. As wages and input prices get more expensive, we're going to see the effect bear out in the short run aggregate supply curve. So higher wages, higher prices, that's going to shift the short run aggregate supply curve in, moving us back to full employment GDP, potential GDP, our steady state equilibrium, back to the long run supply curve. And that's basically what Neoclassical Perspective says. It says, listen, if you let the economy do its thing, running too hot is going to raise the cost of doing business and bring us back to full employment. The economy has the capacity to self-correct in the long run. Pretty exciting, right? So what does this mean? It means that we might not need to do anything about it. What about the other perspective? Let's look at if we're in a recession, okay? Let's go rebuild this really quickly. And I'm going to start out with the same level of potential long-run aggregate supply, GDP. And I'm going to go ahead and kind of keep the colors simple this time because there's our aggregate demand and there's our short-run aggregate supply. And we're going to have an initial price level right here. More fun sound effects. Okay. What happens if we hit a recession? What happens if things go sour? Pandemic happens, right? Pandemic happens. People lose their jobs. People are worried about the future. Expectations are low. Consumers don't want to buy as much stuff. And we see aggregate demand decrease. Sorry, I didn't mean to change the colors up on y'all. That's going to move us from our initial equilibrium down here to a lower level of output and a lower price level. That's bad, right? We're in a recession. We're going to have higher unemployment, lower GDP, and deflation. Here's the thing. Now at this lower equilibrium, what's going to happen to wages? Wages are going to be held down. When unemployment is high, employers have no incentive to hire more workers. Why would they? So instead, what they're going to do is lower wages, which is going to make it cheaper and easier for everybody to produce goods and services. And that's going to shift short-run aggregate supply out. The lower cost of prices and wages from the recession is going to have the effect of moving us back to our full employment GDP here. Do you see that? And so again, with a recession, what we see is the macroeconomy is self-correcting. Through the mechanism of the short-run aggregate supply curve, a recession increases unemployment, lowers wages, lowers prices, shifts short-run aggregate supply out, returns us in the long run back to where we started. So we go from here back to here. The long run effect is just a decrease in the price level. Do you see that? So that's what neoclassical economists believe. They believe that the economy is going to adjust on its own in the long run. Long run's tricky though. How fast is that macroeconomy going to adjust? It depends, and this is where we get into the idea of expectations. Rational expectations is the theory that most people form the most accurate possible expectations about the future that they can using all the information they have available. In an economy where most people have rational expectations about the future, this adjustment is going to be relatively quick, right? We're going to see the change. We're going to know it's coming. We're going to be able to perceive it and respond to it, right? Prices will move quickly enough. People will respond to the changes in prices and wages quickly enough. This theory says that everyone's going to recognize that this process is happening, that we're moving toward this change, and they're going to act on it, right? We're going to say, oh, we're in a recession. Let's lower wages. Oh, wages are low. Okay, now it's time to increase production and shift supply out. That would mean, rational expectations would mean the adjustment, the long run, getting back to full employment would happen pretty quickly. But what if rational expectations don't prevail? There are other assumptions. It could be that people have adaptive expectations. And adaptive expectations is the theory that people are going to look at what happened in the past and gradually adapt their beliefs and behavior to the circumstances. It basically means that people are not perfect processors or synthesizers of information, and they're not going to be great at predicting the future. If a lot of people, a lot of businesses, a lot of entities in the economy have adaptive expectations, then the adjustment is going to be a lot slower. It's going to be more like, where does it go? It's going to be like this, and then this, and we'll slowly, bit by bit, move back to here, maybe over, say, 5 increments. Something like that. That would be adaptive expectations in play. It basically says people are going to just kind of be a little more cautious to accept the change. They're not going to process the information as quickly. What else can we take from this idea of the neoclassical perspective? Well, we want to know what the policy implications are. The Keynesian perspective said, hey, we can use government spending and taxes to expand or contract the economy and solve the problem of a recession. We need to think now about the policy implications of this idea of natural adjustments, of adjusting back to our natural rate of economy through the neoclassical perspective. And one of the things we have to think about is expected inflation. And this is the idea that consumers are going to make decisions based on expectations of inflation in the future. Households, individuals, firms, and businesses are going to build into their understanding of their decision-making for investments, for purchases, for saving, the idea of what they think inflation is going to be. In the Keynesian perspective, the focus is on the government adjusting aggregate demand to get us back to potential GDP. In the neoclassical perspective, aggregate supply is going to determine the output. It's not about aggregate demand. It's driven by supply. That natural rate of unemployment determines the unemployment level, and shifts in demand are just going to alter the price level. And that's the big difference. In the Keynesian perspective, shifting aggregate demand didn't alter the price level. In the neoclassical perspective, that's all really aggregate demand can do, is shift the price level. So here we see an example. In this first graph, we have a vertical long-run aggregate supply curve, and all we do when we shift aggregate demand out is drive prices up. So if I can kind of rebuild this bad boy here, what we're meaning when we say this is if long-run aggregate supply is this vertical line, and there's a natural rate of unemployment that's associated with it, then we're never going to be able to alter those values. We're not going to alter our unemployment rate, and we're not going to alter our GDP. All we're going to do when we shift aggregate demand up with expansionary expansionary fiscal policy, increasing government spending, lowering taxes, all we're doing is driving the price level up. So what does that mean for the Phillips curve? In the in the Keynesian perspective, we had the Phillips curve that looked at unemployment and inflation. Well, if we pull this over here, we see, okay, unemployment doesn't change. It's always at that natural rate, right? YP equals full employment. What does change? What changes is the price level, right? That's going to come over, and so we're going to see inflation be here, and then here, and then here. And so we're going to get a Phillips curve that is vertical in the long run, which is totally different, right? In the Keynesian perspective, we had a downward sloping Phillips curve showing us the relationship between inflation and unemployment, the trade-off. Here, there's no trade-off. You can increase or decrease the price level as much as you want. The natural rate of unemployment is tied to our potential GDP, and so it's not going to alter unemployment in the long run. So When the economy is producing at the potential GDP, the cyclical unemployment rate, the amount of unemployment rate caused by a recession, should be zero. And for neoclassical economists, this view of unemployment focuses on how the government can adjust policies, public policies, government policies, to reduce that natural rate of unemployment. We can't do it with aggregate demand. The only way we can do it is by making it easier for people to find jobs, increasing job training, those kinds of things. They don't see aggregate demand as a tool for changing unemployment. All aggregate demand can do in the long run is drive up the price level. And so neoclassical economists believe that aggregate demand should be allowed to expand only to match shifts in aggregate supply in the short run or in the long run, right? If we see long run aggregate supply shift out because we invent some new kind of supercomputer, then yeah, it makes sense for aggregate demand to increase a little bit. But otherwise, we don't see a role for increasing aggregate demand here because all that's going to do is drive inflation up, drive up the price level. So here you can see aggregate demand determining the price level over time. As aggregate demand shifts to the right, real GDP stays constant at its natural rate, but we're going to see inflationary pressure as the price level increases from the base level of 100 to 100 and I'm going to say 7 to 115. As aggregate demand rises, especially if it rises rapidly, it's just going to lead to inflationary pressure. So, what do neoclassical economists believe about long-term growth and recessions? Basically, they think, hey, listen, the economy has the power to break out of, recover from a recession naturally. It's going to naturally bounce back from a recession, naturally contract from an expansion. Because prices and wages will, in the long run, be flexible, economists don't have a huge role to play. The key policy question is how do we grow long-run aggregate supply, not how do we alter GDP. Economic growth depends on these things down here. The only thing we can do to alter unemployment is have policies in place to help make it easier for workers to find jobs. We want to invest in, instead of altering aggregate demand with things like government spending and tax cuts, we want to invest in physical capital, human capital, and natural resources, enhancing technology, those kinds of things that are going to grow long-run GDP. We also might want to try to improve the market environment to make innovation more attractive. Because innovation, this technology, it's outside of this equation because technology makes everything more productive. It makes workers, natural resources, equipment, and education more productive. So that's the only role, really. The policy implication for a neoclassical economist is not shift GDP to fix the economy. It's deal with structural unemployment, frictional unemployment, deal with unemployment issues with policies, and then enhance human capital and physical capital and technology with policies. So here we ended chapter 12 with data on inflation and unemployment. Here is a collection of unemployment rates and inflation rates for 5 years going from 1970 to 2000. And we can see, at first look, it looks a little bit like a mismatch, right? If I were to try to recreate it, it looks a little bit crazy. But if we wanted to, we could do what the book says and try to kind of derive a line. So let's see what we've got. We have inflation and we have unemployment. And we go from 5% to 4% to 3 to 1. And then we have unemployment rates of 2, 3, 4, oops, I'm going to run out of space, 5 and 6. And so we have one point that is 2 and 4. And we have one point that is 3 and 2. We also have 3 and 3. We have 2 and 4, and 1 and 4, and we have 5 and 4, and we have a point that is 4 and 5, and we have a point that is 6 and 1. And I think that's all of them, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. So what the book says is, hey, this looks like a mismatch, but what if we kind of try to say, maybe this is our natural rate of unemployment? We could draw a long run Phillips curve here. And maybe we also have a short run Phillips curve that's kind of here, right? With kind of this popped in. That might be the real story, right? That it's not one or the other. Maybe it's short run and long run. What do you think? Does that make sense? So the idea is, in the short run, there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. But in the long run, we're going to get back to our natural rate of unemployment, and that's where we're going to stay, because that's based on the health and the structure of our economy. Most mainstream economists believe that. They believe there's a little bit of both. There's Keynesian components and there's neoclassical components to the macroeconomy. We're going to see short time periods with very Keynesian behavior, sticky prices and wages, a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. In the long run, though, the neoclassical perspective makes sense. There is a natural rate of unemployment. There is a natural level of GDP. There's a natural potential in our economy. And doing too much to aggregate demand is just going to drive up inflation. So that's kind of it. Hopefully that was fun. So now you've got a sense of the neoclassical perspective of macroeconomics and the Keynesian perspective. And they're both also just great ways to get a deeper understanding of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and now the Phillips curve. So here we have the neoclassical perspective. Prices and wages adjust in the long run. There's a potential level of output, and the economy's self-correcting. This short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift in if aggregate demand gets too high, bringing us back, or shift out if aggregate demand gets too low, bring us back to our potential level of output and our potential zero cyclical unemployment, full employment level of employment, meaning we have a long-run Phillips curve that kind of tracks, is the same as that long-run aggregate supply curve. In the Keynesian perspective, aggregate supply is more reverse L-shaped, right? Changes in aggregate demand based on recession are not going to affect the price level because prices and wages are sticky. The only thing we can do is use expansionary fiscal policy to drive aggregate demand up and get us back to our potential output level. And that means that there's going to be a trade-off between the level of inflation and the level of unemployment, especially in the short run. Which one is right? Well, it depends on who you ask, but most economists believe a little bit of both, especially whether we're talking about the short run or the long run. So let me know what questions you have, and I'll see you next time. Have a great day.